This is the video for 8-7, and we are talking about perfect square trinomials and the difference of two squares. Now, you do have to memorize this, and we have actually already talked about this before in a previous lesson. And what we were doing is we were taking a binomial and we were squaring it to determine the perfect square trinomial. But now we're going to go backwards. I'm going to give you the perfect square trinomial, and you need to determine what is the binomial being squared in order to get to this perfect square trinomial. So in other words, I'm going to give you the perfect square trinomial, and you're going to factor it. So again, you do need to memorize this. And once you memorize how to do this, the process is fairly simple. So let's look at example number 1, factoring a perfect square trinomial. So you have here x squared minus 12x plus 36. And this is a perfect square trinomial. It is in the form of a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. And a is x and b is 6. A squared minus 2 times a times b plus b squared. So this is why a is x and b is 6. So this is going to be your final answer, x minus 6 squared. So pause the video to make sure that you understand what I did, but this is really just memorizing how a perfect square trinomial factors. Now I want to make sure that you understand why it's 2ab in the center. 2 times a times b. Because look at what happens, for example, when I take a minus b squared. A minus b squared is the same thing as saying a minus b times a minus b. So when I foil these, when I multiply these two binomials together, this is what I get. So look at what happens to these center terms. We can combine them and we get 2ab or negative 2ab here. So that's why that center term is always going to be 2ab, either positive 2ab or negative 2ab. Okay, so go ahead and hit pause and factor these perfect square trinomials. Just identify what is your A and what is your B. And here are the answers. Here, my A is going to be x and my B is 3, because 3 squared is 9. Here, my A is x and my B is going to be 7, because 7 squared is 49. And remember, if this is negative here, this is going to be negative here. If this is positive here, this is going to be positive here. Example number 2, factoring a difference of two squares. Again, it's all about just memorizing. This is the same thing as saying a squared minus b squared. So my a is going to be z and my b is 3. A squared minus b squared. So this is z squared minus 3 squared is z squared minus 9. So that's why my a is z and my b is 3. So this is going to be my answer. Mathematically, this and this are the same thing. And again, I want to make sure that you understand why. Because look at what happens when I take a minus b times a plus b. When I multiply these two binomials together, this is what I get. Well, watch what happens to the center term. The center terms. I have a plus ab and a minus ab. So these are going to cancel out. And then what am I left with? A squared minus b squared. So that's why it works. Again, pause the video to make sure you understand how I got my A, how I got my B, and make sure that you understand why this is my final answer here. And then go ahead and hit pause and factor these. And here are the answers. Example number 3 is the exact same thing. I'm just showing you how it can get slightly more complicated. 16x squared minus 81. Here your A is going to be 4x and your B is going to be 9 because this is A squared minus B squared. 4x squared is 16x squared, and 9 squared is 81. Hit pause and factor this. And here's the answer. Because you can think of it this way, well, what's the square root of this and what's the square root of that? The square root of 25d squared is going to be 5d. So A is 5d. And then B is going to be 8 because the square root of 64 is 8. And finally, example number 4. Now, I know it may feel like I'm going through this fairly quickly, and if you need to rewind it again and rewind this and watch it again, please do so. But really, this is fairly simple if you just memorize the rules. And it's helpful if you understand why the rules exist. But really, if you just memorize the rules, these problems should only take just a few seconds to do. But example number 4, factoring out a common factor. Remember what I said in the last lesson. Always look at it before you start factoring it and say, is there anything I can factor out first? Is there a greatest common factor that I can factor out? And here, yes, I can factor out a 6. So one of my factors is going to be 6. So I can factor out a 6, and then this is what's left inside the parentheses after I factor out my 6. And what am I left with inside the parentheses? I'm left with the difference of 2 squares. A here is going to be 2g, and B is going to be 1. So my final answer, or the factors of 24g squared minus 6, the factors are going to be 6 times 2g minus 1 times 2g plus 1. Because this is a difference of 2 squares. And the difference of 2 squares is going to be a minus b times a plus b. And remember, in my final answer, I have to include the factor that I had pulled out at the very beginning, because mathematically this and this are equivalent. If I factored out a 6 at the very beginning, I have to make sure that I include it in the end, in the final answer. Go ahead and hit pause and factor out the greatest common factor first. And here are your final answers. I pulled out a 12, and then I'm left with the difference of two squares. And then here, I factored out a 3. And what am I left with? A perfect square trinomial.